I'm David Dayen, coming to you from the Prospect offices, which I am rarely at here in Washington, D.C. I'm in a bit of an empty room here. This is one of our several offices that we have in this complex. And with me today, not from D.C., from Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, is Ryan Cooper, managing editor. Ryan, how you doing today?
Oh, not too bad. Just hanging in there.
Hanging in is about as good as we can expect at this point. So I feel like so much happened this week. It's going to be hard for us to summarize and get through it all. But certainly for comedy value, I don't think that you can top the signal situation that happened at the White House this week. Jeffrey Goldberg of The Atlantic was tagged into a signal chat that just so happened to be talking about attack plans on Yemen, on Houthi rebels and Houthi targets in Yemen. The administration tried to get their way out of this by saying that he hacked his way into the signal chat when it clearly he was brought in by the national security advisor, Michael Waltz. Um, uh, there have been a host of other sort of weird conspiracy theories and evasions by the Trump administration. And so far, Waltz still has a job, which, I hate to use. I mean, it's kind of an overused trope of saying if this was any other administration, if this was the Democrats, if this was anyone, there would be somebody who would be held accountable for this. But that, I mean, I don't think there's another story that where it's more true than this one, if only because of the sort of fetishization of national security that I think we have in our politics. But there's nowhere else where you could just tag in a journalist into a war planning operation and not have any kind of accountability for that whatsoever.
Yeah, I noticed that the Signal company, I believe it's like a nonprofit that runs that app, that they put out an update that said moved the invite random journalist button to avoid accidental clicks. Um, yeah, uh, the way is also that the explanation, like, oh, he hacked his way into the this chat. And it's like, okay, if that's true, well, that's why you're supposed to use like the NSA secured government official channels that we built for this exact purpose.
Right. Which apparently have not been you, or at least they have been using Signal probably since the beginning
Yeah.
of the administration. There were references on that chat to other chats. It's very clear that they're trying to evade presidential record keeping. Now there's a lawsuit around keeping this chat, at least that we know of, to maintain the records. Um, uh, so it's very clear that the revolution here is happening on Signal, and I'm sure if that's as much true of kind of the Musk stuff as it is of anything else.
No, absolutely. And I think, that tends to indicate that despite this being hilarious,
Yeah.
like the national security advisor would invite a journalist into your war plans chat, which was called like Houthi PC. Like it was like explicitly named about the operation.
Right. Yeah.
Um, but this is like a very serious, like there are reasons why these things are not discussed on commercial messaging apps.
Right.
Especially not with privately owned devices, which is almost certainly what was happening. You're not supposed to have that because those are very easy to hack. Signal is a pretty secure platform, about as secure as you can get. But like a regular iPhone, if GRU decides to own it, they're probably going to be able to do so. And I imagine have done so. You have to imagine that like any foreign intelligence service just has a periscope into the entire, White House communications. And you know, not only does that potentially put like the lives of US soldiers at risk if somebody gets advance notice of
Right.
when strikes coming, it also reveals that, these are these people were just casually committing war crimes, talking about watching a guy go into his girlfriend's apartment and blowing up the entire apartment building just to get one guy. That's a war crime. That's not allowed. That's in the Geneva Conventions. You're not supposed to do that.
No, I think the amusing nature of this has obscured that element of it. The fact that this is casual introduction, casual admission of war crimes and things of that nature. Uh, it's too funny to be serious, but actually it's also very serious. And I think, I mean, maybe just the ridiculousness of it is why it seems very British to me. Like it seems very Armando Iannucci, but also like these things seem to come up in Britain all the time. Like, Partygate. It feels like that. Like, they were partying, had this big blowout during COVID while they were telling everybody else to stay locked down. So it feels like that, but there are these elements to it that you say that really bring it well beyond that. And clearly we have an incompetent crew. And then obviously, we the reason Donald Trump is where he is today is because the New York Times and other outlets made a federal case out of email security issues from the former Secretary of State. So I mean, that kind of goes without saying that this is the Information Security Administration. Now, we actually did a story this week showing that the incompetence doesn't end at Signal. So about a month ago, we might have got an inkling of what the operational and information security situation was going to be like. Because about a month ago, Dan Boguslaw and Luke Goldstein, who used to be our writing fellow and is now at Delaware, wrote a story about Pete Hegseth's Venmo account, which he had set to public, or at least he didn't set it to private, let's say. And I don't know what the default setting on Venmo is. I don't have it. But he didn't set it to private. It was public. And we saw all his contacts, which were all in from his phone. So we had all his phone contacts. And this is the Secretary of Defense, and anyone could have a window into who his friends are, who his contacts are, and then thereby have an opportunity for blackmail or whatever have you. So when this whole thing came out around Signal, Dan wrote me and said, I think Michael Waltz was one of the people that was connected to Pete Hegseth on his Venmo. I wonder if Michael Waltz is on Venmo. Sure enough, he was there, and he had also not set his Venmo private. So we had a whole list of 300 odd contacts for Michael Waltz. And we were, as you know, Ryan, because you were in on this, we were kind of racing the clock here to get that out. And it turns out Wired got it out a little bit before us, about 10 minutes before us. But we did publish that story. And so that became sort of a secondary thing here. And it wasn't only those. Der Spiegel in Germany found like all these passwords from Waltz and Hegseth that were just readily available online. So the lack of care with which their online lives are being treated is very prominent, very obvious.
Yeah, I think perhaps worth mentioning that even before Hegseth, Matt Gaetz got busted with this whole paying high schoolers for sex things via public Venmo transactions. And neither of these guys took 5 minutes to go into their Venmo settings, having seen that story, which like basically, I think Gaetz was the only like nominee for Trump. He was nominated for attorney general, and then he eventually withdrew his nomination because of that scandal. And neither of these guys took that lesson to go into their settings and just press the private button. I mean, I don't, maybe they don't know how to do it, but like,
I have to tell you that Matt Gaetz I know you don't spend any time on Vichy Twitter anymore, but if you did and you happen to be a follower of Matt Gaetz, you would have seen a link to our story about Michael Waltz's Venmo, and his editorial comment happens to the best of us. Gaetz wrote that, linking to our story this week. I don't know what I think about him having a sense of humor about that, but indeed that was true. It's just a very funny moment when Boguslav told me about that. But
It
okay,
it is wild. Just, I mean, maybe as a final comment that, like Washington, as you said, there's been this sort of like fixation on national security, fetishization of it. And like the number of breaches that have to be assumed to be happening, not only with this stuff and, Der Spiegel going like, InfoSec attack 101 type stuff and
right.
finding passwords. Like we're gonna have to rebuild the entire federal government from scratch, and also with the Doge guys going in and just messing up
Sure.
everything. And it's like not really breaking through at all. Like nobody can kind of believe it's even happening. It's all the
I
media.
wouldn't say it's not breaking through. I think actually it is breaking through. This week in your home state there, we saw Trump plus 15 district flip to a Democrat. That was in a district that was ancestrally Republican, a state Senate district in Lancaster, in Amish country. We also saw this seat that Michael Waltz gave up to become national security advisor is apparently a dogfight contest. This is a seat that Waltz won by 30 points in November, and there are even polls showing the Democrat leading heading into GOTV weekend. That race is next Tuesday. That election, and of course Trump withdrew the nomination of Elise Stefanik to be UN ambassador because he was concerned about her or her potential replacement, losing that seat to a Democrat. And Stefanik was all set. She was doing like a farewell tour at her district, and she gave up her leadership position. And she apparently was, this couldn't happen to a nicer, more horrible person. She was just totally blindsided by this, but they're shook. They are concerned about the lack of support that's happening all over the country.
No, that is definitely true, but I just mean like the sort of official, organs of Washington, and the elite papers. It's not like, the New York Times is running a 72-point banner headline, that like the Russians have owned the government, which they almost certainly have.
Right.
Um, and
I mean, the lack of alarm.
yeah, around this specifically, I think people are more upset about like what's happening to Social Security, the domestic changes that,
Right.
and not so
Well,
much.
that's always going to be the way, right? And we'll get into Social Security in a minute. But one thing I did want to add though about this, because the story that we did about Michael Waltz's Venmo and why we thought it was important was because he had a number of journalists in his phone, and you can see the kind of sordid kind of favor trading relationships that go on in the national security establishment with what is called the blob, which is this sort of agglomeration of former officials, retired military, the media, and various hangers on. They kind of set national security policy, and they usually do it in secret. And this story was kind of a window into exactly how that works and what actually ends up happening, which is that people leak, and there are ways that the narrative gets set through a cozy relationship between journalists and major leaders within our government. And What was funny is that it wasn't limited to just sort of the usual right-wing subjects. We found CNN people in Waltz's phone, MSNBC producers were in Waltz's phone. So it was kind of funny to see, the ways in which this sort of dark arts are practiced.
No, absolutely. Yeah, there are a lot of people who are way more friendly than they would otherwise let on
Right.
with right-wing ghouls like Michael Waltz. And yeah, I think, Jeff Goldberg is not the most honorable person in the world. His past history as a, IDF prison guard is really not so great. But credit to him for doing this, to just like taking it and setting them up too, saying like, I saw all this stuff, and then they claimed, of course, because they're very stupid, and walked right into it. They're like, oh, we never discussed operational details. And Goldberg's like, here's what you said. Here's the screenshots
And
of,
also, they said it was not classified. And
yeah,
so he said, oh, well, now I have, as long as it's unclassified, now I can show it.
yeah.
And so there we go. Yeah, I mean, I think, generally I have no problem with Goldberg on this story. There are others where I may, but on this story, I think generally they did a good job. So I want to talk about a couple of stories you wrote this week, and then maybe some stuff that I did. But to start, maybe we should just dial back because we did release our cover package for our print issue this week. This would be the April issue. We let it go last week of March here, and we both contributed to it. And it's called the Blue State Power Index. And we had the idea that obviously for the next 4 years, we're not going to see a whole lot of opportunity for progressive advance at the federal level. At best, we will, sort of, fend off the hordes who are coming for virtually everything that is decent about government. So where is that level of change going to come from? It's going to come at the state level in the states where Democrats have control. So we wanted to look at, okay, in the past, what has happened in these states and what can we expect in terms of their governance and whether they're going to, take advantage of the opportunity that they have and use their power. And so we looked at the 17 states between 2023 and 2024 that had Democratic majorities. And we divvied them up. It was you, Ryan, myself, Gabrielle Gurley, and Emma Jansen. And we tried to figure out which were the most effective states, let's say, for governing, and which were the least effective. And you did a handful of them, and so including some of the top performers. So why don't you tell us what you found out?
Yeah, I would say there's a sort of general trend where the swing state or sort of lightly blue states that managed to get a majority were way more impressive than the deep blue states. So number one was Minnesota. That was one that I wrote up, and in 2023, 24, they passed just a sweeping set of protections, probably the greatest reform package of any state in like 50 years. I struggle to even think of a comparison over
Right.
such a short time. We got this massive expansion of labor rights, including a paid sick day mandate, ban on non-compete agreements and captive audience meetings, one way that employers bust unions, sectoral bargaining system for nursing homes,
Mhm.
paid and family medical leave system, new protections for abortions and LGBT people, legal weed, free
I had
lunch.
to write it down. There's so many of them. That's why you had to read it off the screen.
It's exactly what I'm doing. Yeah, free lunch for all public school students. I always love to see the non-means tested stuff. That's a great expansion of the basic point of public school. Where like you have $800 billion of spending that just goes without any sort of fee to everyone, and then suddenly we're going to build in the little means tested thing, another 8 billion for food, and it's just stupid.
Right. Right.
So yeah, so that was a really good one. and scroll down a little bit, and towards the bottom you have California and New York, which are like where.
I mean, maybe we were a little unfair because a lot of the things that Minnesota was able to advance, some of them, not all of them, but some of the things Minnesota was able to advance are already in place in
Yeah.
places like California and New York. So we were kind of looking at this 2 year cycle and I tried to take into account a little bit like, all right, California's already passed, renewable energy standard. It's already passed good sick leave protections, already got a progressive tax structure, millionaires tax. So they have less room to go, whereas Minnesota had sort of this pent up set of policies because they didn't hold the governor's mansion in a while. And the one state that kind of, and I did this state, that kind of is the exception that proves the rule of your thesis about the closely contested states would be Michigan. And Michigan, like Minnesota, hadn't had a working majority for Democrats in the legislature and with the governor's mansion in, I think, 40 years. I think it was the early 80s was the last time that they had this opportunity. And it started off pretty good. They did some LGBT protections. They got rid of their draconian, like, 19th century abortion law. Maybe it was early 20th century. I don't quite remember. They did a decent energy bill, but then it kind of devolved into just handing out corporate welfare to everybody. And this is the Democrats in charge. I think it was something like $4.7 billion that was handed out over the course of the 2 year session to people like Ford and GM. They did a data center bill for big tech, make a bunch of data centers and give tax breaks for that. And it just left a sour taste in kind of everyone's mouth, including representatives who were in the legislature who just thought, what are we doing? Like, what is this agenda? And so, it depends. I think generally your rubric is kind of right, but it also depends on the personalities in there. Tim Walz was certainly someone who said, we have political capital and we need to spend it. And Gretchen Whitmer, I gotta say, was much more interested in feeding money to big business than husbanding this political capital and trying to find ways. One thing that she did early on, now both of those states lost their majorities, right? And so I think it's a tie in the state house in Minnesota, and but Michigan outright lost one chamber of the legislature. One thing that Whitmer did very late in 2024 was strike a deal to actually scale back an increase in the minimum wage that was put on the ballot. It wasn't even passed by the legislature. It was put on the ballot, and they pushed it back. They pushed the timelines back. They limited the removal of the tipped minimum wage. So I think there's a pretty stark difference between Michigan and Minnesota when you look at the ambition level of their governors to get things done. And maybe they didn't have the same makeup. Maybe there were too many conservative Democrats that didn't want to push too far in Michigan. But the fact that Minnesota was able to wrangle and they needed every vote pretty much to pass all the things you said. And the fact that they wrangled everyone together to do that, I think it's pretty, it speaks well of the leadership there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they had one vote margin in the state Senate. Um, and yeah, I think personality matters a lot, you wouldn't have expected it from Tim Walz based on his career in the House, where
Yeah.
he was pretty moderate, but he represented a very conservative district, that's got more conservative over time, and he, was sort of trimming his sails to fit. But it turns out he really believed in all the Democratic Party stuff. Um, But and I think that the general dynamic, which again, there are exceptions, it varies a lot from state to state. But in blue states, I think the explanation kind of is like you have classic one party state dynamics going on where there's no competition. A lot of business conservatives basically who would be Republicans in any other state become Democrats just so that they can hold office or participate in politics. Why bother with Colorado, the Colorado GOP, because it's completely insane. That you can't win outside of Lauren Boebert's district. And so, like in Massachusetts, they actually got a substantial amount done. Massachusetts legislature is notorious for dragging its feet
Yes.
on all stuff that's supported by a giant supermajority of Massachusetts residents. But they passed free school meals again, like in Minnesota, a bunch of funding for higher education, free regional bus transit fares, a bunch of other stuff. But a lot of that comes down to the fact that voters in a ballot initiative back in 2022
Right.
levied a 4% surtax on incomes over $1 million. And that gave them just a gusher of tax money that they could then use without having to take the uncomfortable vote, for the donor class to raise taxes on the rich.
And so much of this is about taxes because, there are a lot of blue states that have sort of manacled themselves, shackled themselves, so that they have to limit their ambition. California, you mentioned, is a good example, although that's not really a constraint now that they have a two-thirds majority. You can't pass taxes in California without a two-thirds majority of the legislature. But they've had a two-thirds majority for about 8 years and they've done nothing with it, right? They haven't changed the tax structure, whatever. The tax structure right now is very sensitive to boom and bust cycles. Now that, if the stock market's doing well, particularly for tech companies, they get a lot of capital gains and then they're really flush. And if it's not, then all of a sudden we have a big budget deficit in California. So that's one example. Washington is another, which has no state income tax. And in fact, passed an initiative last year to even further prevent cities and localities from imposing an income tax. So they have to jump through all kinds of weird hoops to come up with taxes that they're allowed to pass. And Colorado is another one with the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, or TABOR,
Yeah.
which has been in place for a long time, and it limits the amount of money that you can generate to fund public services. And I've seen this disease even infect states that don't have this kind of constraint. One of the states I wrote about was Hawaii, and Hawaii generally had a decent enough legislative session. They did, a lot of it was devoted to Maui and trying to rebuild on that part of the island that had that terrible fire. But a lot of the session was about the largest state tax cut in history, which was like $5 billion in tax cuts by 2031. And Hawaii is not a big place. Like 5.6 billion is a lot in a decade for a place like Hawaii. It's not a huge population. And that's just going to limit them in the future. As long as that tax structure stays in place, what are they going to be able to do to fund public services? And so there are constraints, artificial, and constraints that are a little more real, that limit the ability of, I think, a lot of blue states to be very effective.
Yeah. And I think that the kind of example of this dynamic is New York. We've all seen Kathy Hochul, who was sort of on again, off again with the congestion pricing, something that had been in the works for 60 years or something. And they had already spent $500 million on the cameras and tolls and stuff to set it up, and then tried to pull the plug at the last minute and then turned around. There's just a kind of allergy to doing anything. And
We should also give a shout out to another side of this, which is, home state industries that then constrain what a state's level of ambition. I mean, California, you see this with big tech and Hollywood. You see this kind of all the time. There was a bill to help fund journalism in California that was going to basically impose a link tax on Google and Facebook and some of these other tech firms for the privilege of using links. Australia has something like this, and it's worked out pretty well. It was going to be, I believe, a $500 million fund. And then Google got in a negotiating room. And by the time they got out, it was like a $15 million fund. And there was another fund set up from taxpayers to fund AI. So more money was going to Google than they were actually giving back to fund journalism. That's the insanity of when you have a home state industry. And you know about one of these, the home state industry of our first state, the smallest state, well, the second smallest state in the union, Delaware, is corporations. That's the home state industry of Delaware. And this week, a bill just passed that you have written about. It's an example of this, of home state industries dictating the governance structure. But talk about what they just passed.
Yeah, so right, everyone knows, I think, if you're moderately well informed, that Delaware is basically kind of the Ireland of the United States in terms of corporate headquarters, because they've bent over backwards to basically not do very much to them. And so every, like 80% or something of the Fortune 500 companies locate their quote unquote, they put their headquarters there. And the state gets, hundreds of millions of dollars from corporate franchise fees, which are fairly nominal, but because there's so many of them, they get a lot of money. And yeah, Elon Musk's lawyers recently basically wrote a bill for the state to tear up Delaware's corporate law and replace it with something so that he could get a $55 billion payday from Tesla, and which had previously,
It weakens shareholder rights. Is
yeah, he'd lost in Delaware Chancery Court, from like a handful of shareholders who had said, "Hey, wait, this lawsuit doesn't make any sense. As a shareholder, we're talking about like 4 times as much profit as the entire company has ever made in its existence. Why does he get that much? That's not a good fiduciary duty." And they, appealed and lost again. And so Elon Musk quickly went and he threatened to. I think he actually did move the headquarters of Tesla to Texas.
and they
And
were worried about contagion,
yeah,
other companies, deciding to leave, including Walmart, which I believe has threatened it.
yeah, and Facebook too, I think. And so yeah, that was the bill and it passed. And I think it's kind of important to emphasize that Delaware's, previous its specialization as a corporate tax haven wasn't just 100% corruption, because they had developed a great expertise and a real deep legal bench of resolving corporate disputes.
Yeah.
Something that when you're trying to do that in the federal court can be really expensive and take years. And
Right.
so Delaware was all about snappy decisions, getting your, contracts like ironed out in a real
Certain. Yeah.
certainty and efficient legal system. And now they've just completely blown up that part of the whole rationale, because now it's
Right.
just pure corruption. We're not providing any actual services here, because if you're rich enough, you could just go by the legislature and get them to retroactively change the law. And so very short-sighted, I would think, from the Delaware perspective. And that's another one of those states, by the way. I believe it has a very nominal like property tax, very, very little other taxation. So it's not like they couldn't.
No sales tax in Delaware. I know that because being from southeastern PA, people would go get a car in Delaware because it was, you had no sales tax on it.
Right.
Uh, I have a funny story about that vote. There's a woman who's been as expressed to me as kind of the AOC of Delaware, and she was bitterly opposed to this bill. And she happens to be Muslim, and they were debating this bill during Ramadan, and she wasn't able to eat or drink during the negotiating sessions, and she kept having the corporatist wing of the party vote on different amendments where she was trying to improve the bill. And they were like, come on, don't you want to go home? It's Ramadan. Like, why are you doing this? And she's like, nope, we're gonna keep voting. Here we go. And she was like just pissing them off because like just building up this track record of all the corporate giveaways, vote by vote by vote. That's pretty funny. We actually did a piece called The Corporate State of Delaware that goes into just the whole history of this with regard to Delaware. And we did that a couple of years ago. It was in one of our print issues, but you can check that out. Maybe we'll put it up in the chat. But we'll just shout out quickly the top five, and then we'll go on to some other things. Top five, number five was New Jersey, which kind of surprised me a little bit, but they did get a lot done. Particularly around New Jersey transit funding, which was going to run out, and they ended up coming up with a transit fee posed on corporations to get that done. So that was one of their highlights of the year. Number four, Maryland, which the governor proposed 26 different pieces of legislation, and all of them passed. So there are some interesting things in there. Illinois, number three, even though right after this power index came out, he vetoed a fairly anodyne bill about warehouse workers that seemed like a sop to Amazon. But in general, and when I say he, I mean Governor J.B. Pritzker. But in general, Pritzker did a pretty good job in 2023 and 2024. A lot of stuff passed. Number two was Oregon. Which there were two kind of priorities from the governor, Tina Kotek, in the 23-24 session. One was housing and the other was behavioral health, and they did a lot on both those ends. And actually, at the end of last year, Kotek issued an executive order requiring union workers on large state construction projects, which has made everyone crazy, apparently, in Oregon. So good on her. And when I mean everybody, I mean the business community. And number one, as we mentioned, Minnesota. So that's the blue state power index, people. And if you're in a blue state, you want your state to go up the rankings. If we ever choose to do this in the future, call your elected officials and tell them, hey, we're 15th on the prospects blue state power index. You gotta help us out. Anyway. So that's yeah, go ahead.
U.S. News and World Report where all the colleges, bend backwards to get a few spots.
Move over. We got it for you. So anyway, let's move on. You did a couple things this week, Ryan, that I wanted to talk about. The first was kind of looking at I mean, there were a few different ways that you talked about this, but mainly about climate and sort of the disaster we're hurtling towards in terms of Donald Trump taking away all these supports for renewable energy and electric vehicles, et cetera, and sort of how this is seemingly would work against the interests of the man who runs an electric vehicle company. But in your telling, there was another factor that pushed people who might be inclined in other ways into the arms of Trump and the Republicans. What was that?
Well, that was that Kamala Harris briefly mentioned a proposal for a 25% tax on unrealized gains. And what that means is, it refers to the fact that if you own an asset, you don't pay taxes on it. You don't pay capital gains taxes on it until you sell it. And basically, billionaires have built this architecture for themselves where they basically pay no taxes or very little taxes relative to their wealth. So they get all of their compensation in the form of stocks and options. And then those go up in value as the stock market goes up in value. And then they borrow against the value of those assets and then write the interest off on their taxes. And then when they die, there's something called the step-up basis loophole in the tax code where their heirs can basically restart the capital gains tax counter at the new higher basis. And so even their progeny don't have to pay anything. Warren Buffett, as ProPublica covered from 2014 to 2018 paid 0.1% of on his effective income. Like, basically nothing. And so Kamala was proposing to have a tax on the basically a sort of capital gains tax that's imposed like regularly as opposed to only if you sell it, and this drove the billionaire class insane. Even though, by the way, billionaires have historically done much better under Democratic presidents than Republican ones. They did much better under Obama than they did under George W. Bush or Trump. They did much better under Biden than they did under Trump. But it turns out billionaires don't care about that. They only care about their unrealized gains because their piles of money are so big that they effectively, the size of them doesn't really matter that much. They could never spend all of that money. They just don't want to pay any taxes. And so, in 2008, donations over $10 million to the Republican candidates made up about 4% of the total contribution, or about $58 million. In 2024, they made up 56% of contributions to Republicans. And that was a much bigger spending election. It was $2.472 billion.
Mhm.
Elon Musk by himself was more than 10% of that. And then plus he bought Twitter and turned it into a, Nazi propaganda site. And that cost, another 44 billion. And so these guys, including, Elon Musk now, they're associated with an administration that's just tearing up Joe Biden's, elaborate climate policy program.
It's
Trump's
interesting how you connect sort of climate policy, money politics, and tax policy in this story. And what's fascinating to me about it is that the unrealized gain tax that Kamala proposed was like a hot stove. I mean, it's the second she touched it, it was like, whoa, I didn't mean that. I never said that. There wasn't a lot of follow through. It was in Biden's in his budget, and Harris basically adopted the Biden budget. And it wasn't prominent in any messaging. It wasn't prominent. And in fact, Mark Cuban, who was on sort of the team there with Harris, said, "Oh no, she's not going to do that. Don't worry about that. She's never going to do that." He would say that like in the CNBC appearances that he was doing. But even the mere suggestion of this was enough to say, "Uh-oh, we better head this off the pass." And so that's what's interesting to me about
Yeah, you think, you're a billionaire. How hard is it to bribe Democratic members of Congress? Look at the crypto industry. It's not that hard.
it.
You could just say, "Oh, come on, she's not even gonna try to do this. Even if she does, the Congress is you're never gonna get this through the House or the Senate, almost certainly. And even if you do that, you could just get your toadies on the Supreme Court to declare it unconstitutional. Like you have multiple layers of protection." But no, they're like, "No, screw it. We got to get Donald Trump, the criminal madman who screwed everything up the last time and decimated our wealth and killed like a million people in this country. We got to get him back."
Right. And of course, the other thing they're looking at is the fact that the Trump tax cuts expire, and Donald Trump is, very desirous of extending those permanently, which put in a very low tax structure for billionaires. And even more important, maybe than that, is Donald Trump is committed to destroying the IRS. And if you destroy the IRS, the first thing that's going to go is audits of billionaires, right? So I think that's almost even more important than the tax rate itself, because you're talking about the effective tax rate when you're talking about easing up on enforcement. If you create this environment where you can kind of pay whatever taxes you want, the people with the wherewithal, with the fancy lawyers who care about this stuff are probably going to be the ones who benefit the most from a lack of enforcement at the IRS. So to me, it was as much about that too, particularly that money, that IRS money, much of which for enforcement has already been taken away in successive government funding bills, including the one that passed just a few weeks ago, took away another 20 billion from the IRS.
Yeah, and I think it tend, the way that the radicalization gets so extreme among, the billionaire class and leads them, I think, to discount their own like long-term, self-interest because you can't run a modern state without a tax authority.
Right.
It reminds me, it's similar to Elon Musk tearing up Delaware's corporate charter, even the parts that are actually important for governing a capitalist business appropriately. Uh, great big chunks of the administrative state. It's all about like safe food and water, enforcing contracts and property rights and stuff like that. That's all being undermined. And, you do wonder if, the Doge people do sufficient damage to the administrative state that like you could have some sort of a financial crisis and the capacity wouldn't be there to manage it, at the Federal Reserve and the other agencies that the FDIC, the SEC that would be needed to come in and clean up the mess. And you just have like a totally chaotic collapse of the whole system that supports and underpins the wealth of the billionaires in the first place. And all because they couldn't bear the idea, not just paying their fair share, like paying anything at all.
No.
The like your average working stiff pays a vast, probably a quarter of your income when you add up all the sales tax, income tax, and all the various other fees. Uh, it's not nothing, It ends up being a sort of flat tax across the income distribution if you add them all up, federal, state, local, except at the very tippy tops of society where the effective taxation rate collapses
Right.
to as little as 0.1%.
Yeah, absolutely. What you're really talking about is why we need a government at all, and
Yeah.
why it's worth paying for and funding appropriately. So, the other story you wrote, and it's just up on the site today, and that is about Norway, our favorite Nordic state. Is our favorite Nordic state? It's one of our favorite Nordic states. But Norway, obviously, what's very interesting about them is that because of their accumulated oil wealth, because of North Sea drilling, they combine sort of the social democratic features of a Scandinavian state with like Saudi Arabia, right? Like with and what they've done is they've created a wealth fund, really because they knew that they they were going to need to diversify at some point. What's funny is that most of Norway runs on electric vehicles. Like they're one of the, despite profiting off of oil wealth at one point and continued through this wealth fund, they recognize sort of the need to be ecologically sensitive. But anyway, so they have this wealth fund, and just tell us about that, and tell us about you've made a recommendation for their wealth fund.
Yeah, this is financial advice. Yeah, so Norway has like some odd $1 trillion, 18 trillion kroner in its fund. They own about 1.5% on average of every publicly traded company in the world. I mean, a truly absurd. If you divvy it up according to the population share, you're talking about many hundreds of thousands of dollars per Norwegian. Um, and yeah, that's it's kind of funny. They almost couldn't spend it, as if they did, it would drive up the value of the currency, destroy their domestic economy, and they wouldn't have anything left. Anyways, so as part of that portfolio, they have 35.7 million shares of Tesla, which is just basically because they invest in almost everything. And so you get a 1.1% stake of Tesla. That's how much it is. And they're like the eighth biggest shareholder or something like that. They
But they're
don't
not exactly like an index fund,
no.
sense that they don't buy everything sort of without care or concern for what they're buying, right?
No, it's explicitly not an index fund. It's actively managed.
Right.
It has like some of the lowest fees of any financial institution in the world. It's like a small fraction of like, Blackstone or whatever. But they have, by according to government regulations from the Ministry of Finance, certain rules on the type of companies that they can invest in. You don't want to be associated with, they don't invest in coal. They don't invest in tobacco companies. They don't invest in weapons manufacturers that make stuff that's highly likely to cause collateral damage, like cluster munitions.
Mm.
Um,
Right.
and there's also just a general, sort of humanitarian qualification. Companies that a company that contributes to or is responsible for serious or systematic human rights violations or other particularly serious violations of fundamental ethical norms. And you look at
Okay.
what,
So you apply this, because so they have these constraints, these responsibilities, this type of investing strategy, and you apply that to Tesla. Now go through the steps of, it was kind of two steps, right? It was one, it's a bad bet, like it's a bad actual investment, and the other is it violates some of these core principles.
right. Yeah. So I guess to back up slightly, you look at Tesla, and for a while it was valued at $1.4 trillion, like the third biggest company in the world or something. It's since fallen to about 500 or no, 888 billion. Was yesterday when I
Right.
looked at it. But that is a preposterous valuation for a car company. And because of Elon Musk's antics, throwing a Nazi salute at Trump's inauguration,
Mhm.
constantly like interacting and reposting open Nazis on Vichy Twitter, the brand has been ruined, especially in Europe. So Europe as a whole, sales are down 49%. In Germany, the biggest car market in Europe, they're down 71%. In China, their second biggest market, they're down 49%. That's just because they're getting their lunch eaten by BYD and the other Chinese companies, which have stolen a march on them. Tesla just hasn't innovated in like 6, 7 years.
Right.
Um, and in California, they're down. I haven't seen, quarterly figures yet, but in 2024, they were down substantially for the first time in years. And it's just like that's a business consequence of Musk alienating his core customer base of affluent, environmentally conscious liberals in Europe
Right.
and in California.
Right.
Uh, and still, so 888 billion is preposterously overvalued. If you valued it like Toyota, which sells 6 times as many cars and made 7 times as much profit last year, it'd be worth about 75 billion. So unload while the unloading is good, I say, because I don't, it's only new product since 2019 is the Cybertruck, and the Cybertruck's a flop. Sales are way under expectations, and now they just had to recall everyone because the crummy glued body panels are falling off. This thing's held together with baling wire and chewing gum.
Right.
Um,
So you are not a fiduciary, as I understand it. So we
no.
should not. This is not stock advice that we are giving out here on the weekly roundup. But it's an informed opinion, I would say,
Yes.
to Norway's global government pension fund. So if there are any Norwegians in the audience right now, if they could get that information into the hands of someone who can act on it, we'd appreciate it. But actually, I mean, it's interesting you came up with this because it's not something that's isolated to that. I mean, the American Federation of Teachers went out to institutional investors in America and said, you should probably review your Tesla holdings. The California Public Employees Retirement System has been sitting on a request to review their Tesla holdings since last October. And I imagine there are states all over the country, at least in the blue areas, these states we talked about, these 17 states, now 15, where they might be receptive to the idea that A, this is a bad bet, and B, this doesn't align with our values.
Yeah. And that I think, is the more convincing part of the case. Because, you look at what Musk is doing in Africa is like shaping up to be one of the worst crimes in history. You know, they've cut off, you know, USAID has basically ceased to exist. The PEPFAR program, which provides access to HIV drugs at like pennies a dose, has been frozen. The vaccine and tuberculosis program has been frozen. And a bunch of experts told Nicholas Kristof at the New York Times, you know, you add it up, and they think that the HIV cutoff will kill about 1.65 million people. Cutting off food aid kill 550 million people. It's already killed many.
Mhm.
Um, Vaccines, 500,000, mostly children. Tuberculosis, 310,000 people. Malaria funding, 290,000 people. And that's each and every year. 3.3 million people per year killed.
Mhm.
Um, and that, like, to be, you know, associated with that, like, I think any Tesla shareholder is implicated in that. And the more shares you have, the more you are. And I think it just is completely at odds with Norway. Like, I would rather them own coal than own Tesla. Like, this is one of the worst things that's ever happened. And
One of the
it's,
interesting things, and I don't think we've seen it formally, but there is certainly a case to be made that Elon Musk's activities are kind of a form of securities fraud. I don't know if I call it fraud, but that he is materially harming the value of the stock by his actions, and that the board of directors should take action to protect the company by either telling him that he needs to stop his government activities and come back and rescue the company, or relieving him of his duties as CEO. There's a strong argument for that. In any other context, I mean, I hate the in any other context, but at any other public company, if someone's extracurricular activities, and by the way, when is he spending any time on Tesla? He's not doing anything to do with Tesla. But in any other context, a CEO's extracurricular activities that were having a material impact on the stock and the business as a whole would be seen as grounds for firing, or at least grounds for some sort of internal investigation into whether this was a problem. And Tesla's corporate structure, to go back to Delaware, right? Tesla's corporate structure just doesn't allow for anything like that because it's largely a cult of personality around this one figure.
yeah, that's right. And I think that's why they haven't done it. You know, anybody
Yeah.
can see the writing on the wall. This is why, by the way, Tesla executives and board members have been selling Tesla stock hand over fist. Every time a compensation package drops, they immediately throw it into the market. They
You
sold
had some incredible numbers in this story that insiders had sold. What was the number?
it's about 750,000 shares just in the last 3 months.
When you say insiders, you mean executives at the company? You
Yeah,
mean people? Yeah. Okay.
big time shareholders and executives and board members.
Right.
They're the rats are deserting the ship. Even including Tesla's or sorry, Elon Musk's brother, Kimball Musk. They can
He
see,
sold?
yeah, he sold a bunch of
He
stock.
ought to know, right? Uh, okay. Well, I think the whole thing's fascinating, and to the extent that there should be some shareholder activism around this, it seems like that would be what to do. And whether it's institutional shareholders like the country of Norway, or a pension fund or a retirement fund, or even individual shareholders who can contest the fact that their CEO is DOA and tanking the stock. Okay. We are out of time. Ryan Cooper, managing editor of The Prospect, thank you for coming on today. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
We are here every week, Fridays at 12:30 Eastern, 9:30 Pacific. We will be back next week with another edition of the weekly roundup. And we also put this one up on the site so you can watch this conversation over the weekend if you wish. Thank you very much for being here, and have a very nice weekend.
Bye bye.